Thank you very much. You know, I should have put computer-based musical instruments in this title. It's really mainly about that idea. And first thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge a number of collaborators, and I know that I've left a number of people out, but I think I've captured the main ones. And I just want to mention that Adrian Freed is right here with us tonight and is here in Montreal at Concordia, where he's doing some graduate work and so on, but it's just been fantastic. So much of the work that I'll even present today was very much influenced by and aided and abetted by Adrian. So it's great to talk to him outside of the CIRMMT context and so on. Well, let's take a look just at the landscape of computers. I mean, laptops are very popular in clubs today. They're part of a whole scene. The only thing that I'm unhappy about when I go to concerts and electronic things and so on is that people are sitting behind their screens, looking like they're doing office work, or I don't know what they're doing, maybe email, I don't know. But a lot of sounds coming out, of course. And so I want to emphasize today work that I think is very important for this area, is the idea of building better interfaces and controllers. And so I'll be spending a fair amount of time on that issue. And then I want to talk about how we can use these machines, which are quite interesting and, well, highly programmable, and they can play a role in listening as well. They can help us hear what's going on around us. And if we're improvising with other people, I think it's really nice to have a bit of help in knowing something about that. And so I'm going to say something about that. Then when you're playing with musicians who are playing acoustic instruments, which I like to do a lot, you know, with loudspeakers, it always feels like we're on two different acoustical planets, if you will. It's almost as if the speaker itself doesn't engage the room, particularly if it's a small room, or particularly if it's like a chamber music setting, which is kind of what I like the most. This is a spatial homogenizer, at least one of these is, or a couple of them are. And so I want to say a few words about some efforts that we've made to build source model loudspeakers that might help us make the radiation patterns of the speakers as rich as those of the acoustic instrumental world. And if I went away without saying something about the future, where we can see, I think I would have done a disservice. So I'm going to make a guess and a big bet about the way it's going, and I think it's an obvious bet, and that is we're really in an era where we have mobile devices, clients of various kinds, we have cloud computing, the internet, all these massive amounts of data and computational horsepower at our fingertips, and then we're really enriched today with a whole variety of new sensors and so on. So I want to try to speculate a bit about what the problems are and how we might approach those things. So that's an outline of the talk. Now, when you're doing improvisation as opposed to playing a composed piece, you've kind of given up a big fragment, or in a large sense, the timeline. Oh, you might say something, oh, we'll do this for a while, and that for a while, and this for a while, and so on. But oftentimes, particularly if it's a freer improvisatory context, there is no timeline. And unfortunately, most of the DAWs, and I would say, including Ableton, as live as it pretends to be, have a timeline and orient you in that manner. So I'll say something about that later, composing the instrument instead of composing the timeline. And well, we need some, very mutable representations of material, as well as things that enable us to shift rapidly from one context to another and react. And I think one thing that we should really pay a special attention to is the control of dynamics, being able to really play very softly, play loud, and to have that control not out at the mixing desk, well, we want it there too, but we want to have the musicians who are in the situation controlling their own dynamics and blending and so on. So that's also very important. So compose the instrument, not the timeline. And use some representations that we can alter So that means thinking about things like turning on a dime, bringing up something that you hadn't thought you'd need, but you want it right now. Being able to really alter the kinds of sound material that you have at your fingertips and so on. And so you really have to design all of that in so that it's accessible at all times or at any time. So in composing the instrument, that means like thinking about the way the interface is going to be mapped to the algorithms that you're using, thinking about how the material is going to be put at your disposition, how you're going to allocate the resources which are limited always, even if we have highly parallel architectures which we're working on and so on, and we have a massive amount of compute power. I think most of us are always running out of gas. Today I'm operating at the limit of my machine, which is usually I go up to I can't go beyond that, you know. So I have to think about allocating resources and doing that on the fly. So a kind of dynamic scheduling and all that stuff's important in this kind of a situation. So here's a sort of schema that I've liked to use to, you know, get at all of the features of a computer-based improvising instrument. Let's start here. I think at McGill we want to start right at the sensor level. And we have to process those gestures in some ways. There are issues having to do with gesture recognition, gesture tracking. And in fact, it's very important, I believe, to not only recognize, but to track simultaneously. So tracking, most of the work in machine learning and gesture has been to recognize the gesture itself, and that's it. But we need to know something about its magnitude and the way it's used in an expressive way. So we need to do that simultaneously. And that's a kind of tricky affair because we may not know ahead of time as we're moving whether to track this. So we have to kind of have several hypotheses around as to what gesture might be available. Now, at CIRMMT with Frédéric Bellevacqua group, they've done some interesting thing looking at tracking gestures with multiple hidden Markov models. And then they do the Viterbi forward-backward business, and then they look at the likelihood that your gesture is actually in play. And I think they're getting some nice results. We could also think of having gestures that we have certain features of the gesture itself are signal the moment that you're supposed to engage the gesture and so on. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and I do look forward to that session tomorrow. Now, most of the time, we get but a few dimensions out of the gesture, like X, Y, Z, pressure, these kinds of things. And or we recognize the features of the gestures and we track them, but this is usually quite lower dimensionality than the dimensionality that we need to control very complex synthesis algorithms or generative algorithms that do more than just make signal sounds, but do orchestration and that are conductible in some sense. For example, tonight, later when I perform, I'll be playing a lot with 100 oscillators on every finger. And that means there are, well, let's forget about the phase. Let's just worry about amplitude and frequency. That's 200 parameters per finger, and I have to map the three dimensions of control, that is the X and Y axis on my controller, with respect to one finger to those 200 parameters. So it's a low to high dimensional controls thing. And well, if you think about that a little bit, if all those dimensions are independent, you can't do it. So what you need to do is compose the correlational structure, the inner structure of this high dimensional space, so that it can be controlled in an interesting way from these lower dimensional gestures. So you need to, this is an act of composition here to go from low to high. Of course, in the end, we want to come out right into our ears in some way, not too loud, and evaluate then the results. Now, oftentimes we're really going to be in a situation where we are intending what to do. I want to go there, I want to make a crescendo. I want to get this pitch set that I'm using to match up with what the other musicians are playing and so on. So that, I think, that certainly takes a lot of skill and so on. But at the same time, we want to have an exploratory relationship with the instrument. And I want to argue that it's very important in the practice of improvisation and the practice of understanding how your instrument is behaving to do something that I like to call babbling. It's what babies do when they're trying to learn how their vocal apparatus works. And, you know, they start out, don't have any idea of what they're going to say. They're just trying to figure out somehow what the mapping is between their motor cortex, what their commands are sending down the vocal tract are, and the sound that results. And it's important in many systems to do this kind of babbling if we're going to learn a unique inverse where the output space is not convex. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into this control theory in detail here, but let me just say this. Most learning algorithms that use feedback alone, when confronted with a non-convex inverse mapping problem like is shown here, can't learn the mapping. That seems to be the case for the vocal tract. In other words, there are many configurations of the vocal tract that give rise to the same vowel. And it looks like it's a non-convex setup and takes this babbling situation to work. Interesting work in robotics on this by Mike Jordan and Dave Rummelhart some years back, and very much a part of the whole idea of building forward models. We think it's a big part of this. The way in which we develop these forward models is very much part of a lot of cognitive neuroscience today, and I think plays a role here. So I'm encouraging the people, I'm happy to be at a music school to get their performers to, no matter what instrument they're playing, to think about babbling on the instrument, to find new kinds of things to do. Okay, here's my controller, and rather than go into detail about how it works and how my mappings are, I'm going to save that presentation, that discussion of that, for the concert itself. So it'll be a kind of concert atelier instead of just a plain old concert, because I see that I'm going to run out of time here. And you know, my machine just went to sleep. I've got a clock down here. I couldn't find one. Okay, I'm still on. I'm on schedule, more or less. So, I think the unique feature of this that I can say now is that each of these pads is touch sensitive, and there's an x-axis and a y-axis, and they're pressure sensitive. There are 32 altogether, and that means there are 96 variables in all, and these data are not sort of massaged and turned into events at the, this is a little microprocessor here on a FPGA. There's a little PowerPC in here, and a field program of gate array. And by the way, Remus Avizenius is the person who did this. Adrian played a big role in the design of this gadget. These signals coming from these pads are sampled at a high rate, in fact at 1/8 the audio rate, and they are turned into floating point, 32-bit floating point numbers right here, ripe and ready to be incorporated into Max MSP. And then they're sent over Ethernet to the computer itself down there. And this is something I like about it very much. In other words, I'm not sending events anymore. I'm sending sample synchronous data from the tips of my fingers, and it feels like I'm really connected very intimately to the sound itself. And it's nice. A couple other technical details. Open sound control here, a bit of information coming out of a tiny display, foot pedal inputs and so on. And then we have optical output, ADAT. And in fact, today I was able to send the ADAT via MIDI back to the board. So I didn't have to use any outboard. It was very convenient. I was very happy. It's the first time I've had a chance to do that in this kind of a context. I've done it in studios, but not in a live setting. Now, we didn't abandon MIDI, but all we've got here is MIDI in, so that the MIDI data can be multiplexed into the stream of data that's being sent. That means all this audio data and open sound control data and so on. It just gets rolled into that and sent. And we've done drivers. Remus has done some drivers for the core audio on the Macintosh, and so it's been a remarkably robust and nice behaving system. And I'll say more about the mappings that I'm using tonight when I use them. But one mapping I'm really keen on is that somehow the force gesture itself gets mapped to dynamics. And it's really disappointing that so many interfaces, and I think I counted something like the majority of 9 papers on new kinds of interfaces did not really address this issue of dynamics. You change all sorts of things, but the dynamics is still some kind of a knob somewhere or maybe a volume pedal. It's at that level rather than at the level of how each individual note is played. Like if you're voicing a chord, you might want to play some of the notes softer than others. So you need pressure sensors on the kinds of things that you're interacting with. And individual polypressure, which got neglected. That's funny. How did that happen? Well, I guess the MIDI people had trouble implementing it. It was difficult. Had to have sensors on special sensors on every keyboard and on every key. And then I guess at the time there was a lot more data. Of course, by today's standards, there's no problem. But it somehow got left out, and I think it unfortunately got left out of people's minds, with one exception. And my favorite keyboard synth at the time was the ASR-10 from Ensoniq, which had Polypressure, but built into the instrument itself. And one of my favorite musicians who plays this and improvises with it is Michel Pascal, and he treats it as if it's 76 or 88 pots for each of the keys, and has a wonderful sound library that he's built for it that responds very nicely to this polypressure. So pressure is really important, and I really want to insist upon it as an important thing. Now, another reason I think that pressure is critical is it's a way that we communicate how much force we're applying to the instrument. A lot of the complaints about computer music and about having controllers that we can arbitrarily map to different processes is that people don't sense the connection between the gesture and the final result. But one thing we can do for almost all the things that we do, and I say almost all, is that if we show or display force in our performance practice, that communicates, I think, something about our intentionality, what's going on in the music, and I think a great deal of it is that. So when we're watching a pianist, we can see that. When we're watching a string player, we can see that. We don't have to know about the exact manner in which the buttons, for example, on an oboe even are working. We can sense something about the force that's being introduced into the performance. And so I think this will go a long way to this, quote, audience problem that we talk about a lot with these arbitrary controllers. Yeah. I think we ought to put that up all over the place. I can't, it's just in everybody's vocabulary. Well, I've got these triggers set up, and when I do this, it triggers that, and when I do this, and then I start this, and I stop that, and start this over there, and stop that. Well, I think you get the idea. Let's try to shape things as opposed to trigger them. Now, I know we're going to have to turn continuous signal-like data into events from time to time. Of course we do. But if we start with shapes and try to carry them as far the way through our software that we can, that we're performing with, and then here and there when we have to say, oh, this was something or other, or we better bring in this file, or we could start playing this sound file now. You know, it's funny, isn't it interesting that computer music, live computer music, often amounts to just having a bunch of sound files around that are triggered by a performer from time to time in the concert? I mean, it's better than the old days when the tape was sort of the rigid timepiece that the performer had to get fixed to. But on the other hand, we haven't gone into the shaping business, I think, is very important. And, well, look, if you start thinking this way, then you're going to have to practice. That's another thing, and it turns out there's going to be the need for some skill and so on. Now, we've worked for a number of years on, and these ideas are incorporated into the instrument that I'll be playing as well tonight, and into the idea of using a two-dimensional structure, just because it's a surface, it can be easily navigated in, it makes great intuitive sense to us. We can have these sounds over there, those sounds over there, and so on. And then we can move about with a gesture among them. And again, use this force on the array to indicate something about the dynamics. So we've built some tools over the years, and this is the latest rev, which is available for free on our CIRMMT site. It's the RBFI is the name of the module. And it's basically what we call a radial basis function interpolator. So the way you use this is you lay out the material in the space. In other words, you can have, let's say that there are various timbres, okay, because I worked on this timbre space idea for a number of years, and Stephen has too. So we can lay out our palette of timbres on this, and this is like a palette. And then we can define, so we can lay it out, and we can actually have hundreds of them up there. And rather than using multidimensional scaling technique to get the similarity data, or to acquire similarity data by pairwise comparison, we've been finding that just laying them out in an intuitive way, that goes over there, oh, that's like that, we'll put the flute next to this other flute-like thing that we have, and we'll put the oboe and English horn-like sounds together, and so on. We can do a pretty good job of creating a palette, and then we can decide by the parameters that are available here how various items in the palette are going to, in fact, influence each other. So we can control the zone or regions of influence of these basis functions that are used to go among. And there are many other features here. We can get the weights out. It works with patter, and we can translate it very quick. It's very efficient. And I just have to tell you a little story that about the way this work is going. A couple of years back, I got asked by a hearing aid company, Starkey, if we could do something about the musical quality of hearing aids. I mean, many people complain that they're not well adapted to listening to music. And so we set out to see what we might do. And I didn't really know much about hearing aids, but I knew that somewhere, at some time in my life, I was probably going to need one. I'm hoping I'll live long enough. I certainly, for my own musical purposes, want to keep my instruments working well. So I thought, well, it's probably really worth working on this. And we started to find out, in fact, the really disappointing thing about working on hearing aids is, glasses, these things here, they pretty much fix your vision up real well. I mean, they correct the optics, and you can see kind of about as good as you'd see without them, or even better. Hearing aids don't fix up fried hair cells. They don't do the best they can yet, I don't believe, but you don't get back, you don't correct. The fact that we use a compressor in a hearing aid doesn't give back the compressive character of what we think the outer hair cells are doing, and so on. So it's important to recognize that, and that's part of my crusade to not to save our ears for the future. It's really disturbing how fast our young musically inclined people are losing their hearing. Anyway, so as we were working with people on this, we found out that people we decided, oh, there's so many parameters to adjust in this hearing aid. How are we going to deal with it? Well, why don't we use this dimensionality, low to high dimensionality control? So why don't we use a space like that, give it to see if we could actually make this work. A typical hearing aid compressor would have 70 parameters. And how do we go from like this 2D kind of representation to 70? Is that reasonable? Can we do that? So we did some experiments and ran some real subjects, and we looked at what people were doing with these arrangements, and we found out that to some extent this was a usable idea, and that they could choose this, adjust their aids to accommodate not only music itself, but the different genres of music. They had different settings for rock kind of things, different settings for classical music, and people had there were individual differences and so on. So we really thought we were on the, cusp of having something that would give individual users of hearing aids a tool for doing their settings. Well, this has gone pretty far now. Now at Starkey, they've got it running on the iPhone. They're communicating with via network connection to the experimental hearing aids itself. So, and we presented this, by the way, 2 years ago, these ideas to an audiology conference in Paris, and my God, I guess we made some demonstrations, and it was almost as if they thought we were trying to put them out of work. But they don't really, most audiologists don't spend a lot of time prescribing at the level of detail that we would like people to be able to make their fine adjustments with. So I'm encouraged by this notion that these spaces can be used in an intuitive way and without much knowledge by ordinary people, including ordinary musicians. Now, we're in a kind of multi-touch era, for sure. The whole gesture thing is, I think, if you want to know I was very skeptical about the iPad. My girlfriend has one. It's been a total success for her. And it seems to have taken off, and the gesture business is important. I'm not happy about Apple's, we can talk about patents and the control Apple has on it over wine later, but I think we're in an era now where the touch surfaces and things that we can caress are going to play more and more a role. So we'd like to go full tilt with this. We'd like to go to systems that would allow us to, I don't want to hit any things up here, but let's imagine that we're striking a kunga or that type of a surface, and we want to be able to get an idea of what the image of the hand, how the taxels, which are the tactile analog of a pixel, are, transducing the figure of the hand. It's like a video camera, but we have to run it at a pretty high rate to get the image of the hand into what might be a useful situation for sound. And so we haven't solved this problem yet because, as you'll see in the next slide, it's not easy. Let's say you have a 20 by 20 array, and that you just beat on it like we would want to as percussionists and so on. And let's say that we're going to go for 100 taxel per square inch resolution. Maybe that's overkill. There's some interpolation we can do it. 12 bits per taxel, all this. And if you do a little bit of back of the envelope calculation, you see that you need 10K hertz to get a good, accurate image of the accurate story about, or data stream about the dynamics of that image of the hand as it moves through. So if we look at the image processing requirements they're actually 300 times more than processing video images. And so when you tell this story to Intel, they say, great, more computation. So we're actually working on this problem within the parallel computing lab, although we don't have the arrays yet. But there is some hope to build better arrays, and maybe I want to say a bit about what one of our visiting scholars, Young Sip Guo, is doing, along with Adrian Fried's influence here, who's done a lot of work with textiles as sensor systems. But this is a multi-touch array here, a small one, certainly a prototype. It's made on a sewing machine, and we can sample that. It's sensitive to pressure. It's something from which we can get the image out. Here's last week's version, finer grid and works a little better, thicker, it actually has a nice feel to it. It's felt, again, and she's done some interesting work in her own PhD work in Korea on conductive threads, and so the conductive thread goes into the bobbin in the sewing machine in CIRMMT's basement, and she's building these things to try out, and it looks very promising. Now, so making something a caressable instrument, if you will, I think one of the nice features of this is that these can be very quickly put together and put around curved surfaces and so on. They don't have to be restricted to a flat surface. And I, for one, would rather caress curved surface than a flat surface myself. But anyway. Now, I got to put a plug in for open sound control. I know you know a lot about this here at CIRMMT, and I've talked to Julian and so on about this stuff he's doing with it, and so I'm pretty happy to hear. We heard recently that Logic has adopted it, and of course we knew that Mark of the Unicorn had put it in the Digital Performer native, and the Native Instruments people have put it in. So it's catching on. There's a nice full-blown implementation of the latest spec in Python that you can find on the web. And most of the implementations, because the timestamping issue has been difficult to solve in a very totally general way, but it looks like the timestamps are here now, and but many of the implementations don't use them, and for sometimes that's okay, because these are just events and often used as triggers, actually. And the whole idea that you can support bundles of messages is very, very important. That is, that you can send out a whole body of things that you want to have happen atomically all at once, and in a timely manner at a particular thing. And we are, as I say, very pleased to see this as being widely adopted. So one more plug for CIRMMT technology that we feel works. Now, I want to move on to talking about, and let me recalibrate. My clock keeps leaving me. There I am. Oh, I do have to move along here. A lot more to. So let's talk about the machine listening issue for a moment. And I have to say, is Carolyn Palmer here? Oh, I was using some of her ideas in this too. One idea that I like to use a lot is the tone profile, which comes from originally from Crum, Hansel, and Shepard, and Crum, Hansel, and Kessler. The idea is that there's a lot to say about this. It turns out, if you are, in fact, let's say in C major, then you'd have a lot of Cs, so that particular pitch would be appearing quite often or be sounding quite often. G would be sounding quite often as well. And things like C sharp and the notes that aren't in that particular principles in that particular key wouldn't sound as often. So that profile not only characterizes the frequency of occurrence of notes that people are producing or composers have scored in their music, but it's also it's a good predictor of our expectations of what we think fits in various contexts. So it has a kind of, this ties in very much to this whole statistical learning point of view that we're thinking about a lot in music perception today, that we kind of get used to the regularities, statistical regularities that are in the world, and use them to guide our judgments of the expectations that we have. So anyway, a tone profile is a good thing to collect from your performer while you're performing with him. So what I've done is built a software in Max MSP that allows me to listen to the last 1 second of sound and calculate via a histogram the frequency occurrence or how much time is spent on different notes. And then I listen for, at the same time I'm listening at a running window of 2 seconds. Gives me a little broader perspective on the harmonic activities. Last 4 seconds, last 8 seconds, last 16 seconds, 32 seconds, 64 seconds, and so on. And so I can sort of look at what's going on in a local and more global way as I'm listening. And you can also do this with rhythmic profiles. And that's why I ask about Carolyn Palmer, because here, for example, is here's a kind of a beat 6/8 time, let's say. Well, we'd expect that a lot of notes are going to be happening on the first beat. This is a stylistic thing as well. So it's not every 6/8 every style would necessarily have to behave this way, but this would be a pretty common way of thinking about it. A reasonable number on 4, but maybe not as many as on 1, because we want to have the whole cycle of 6 be important here. And then the upbeat, 6th beat, probably reasonable frequency, and then these 2 and 5 might have very low probability. I also like to think of it more than just probability. It's kind of like importance here. This is a hierarchy of importance for these various rhythmic events. And we can look at how loud the notes are. We can look at how long they are, what their on-off times are like. Not what the inter-onset times are like, but what the on-off times are like. And timbral variations and so on can play a role here. So we can have these profiles. It's been part of the rhythm engine that I've been using a lot, although I'm not using it today. I'll say something about that later. Now, these profiles, be they about pitches or about time points, have a lot of interesting features. And let me just say a few words. If you, for example, take a profile and apply a nonlinear transformation to it, let's say you compress it upwards, so you bring up the low entry levels in the profile up to make the profile somewhat flat, then you get a lot of notes. It's a nice control over density. And you can make the analysis think about this in that way too, but we can also use it in the generative way. The nice thing about these ideas, these statistical ideas, is that they're not only good for analysis of what's going on, but they're good to constrain and otherwise determine how the reaction or how the accompaniment that you might want to put together are going to come out. So that flattens the profile, ups the density. Expansion, that is, you're going to push down the small values and just heighten the large ones. Large ones are going to get bigger, and the small ones are going to get smaller, and that's going to give you a kind of a skeletal outline of the structure, be it rhythmic or harmonic, and so on. Now, thing that I learned from working with Archie Comte at IRCAM and working with him on his thesis is that these profiles really fit nicely into the framework of information geometry. Shlomo Dubinov has also worked on this idea as well. Now, information geometry ties in with this spatial stuff that I talked about before. You know, these layouts and flat. Well, what happens here is profiles appear as points on manifolds in some Riemannian geometry. And there are nice distance measures or divergence measures. They don't have to even be symmetric among them. And so you can lay your material out in a way that can be meaningful. And so I think that's worth following up on. It's a very, I think, important feature of them. They're multinomial distributions is what they are. And when you get into doing analysis with multinomial distributions, probability distributions like this, you have at your sort of a number of interesting new non-parametric data mining techniques, unsupervised data mining techniques that use the Dirichlet distribution as a prior for these multinomials. John McCollum has used this recently in a piece. He's an ex-McGill graduate, where he, in fact, generalizes these things to a timbral thing using histograms that operate on 1 cent intervals. So the histogram is 9,600 points long, and I'll be using that kind of thing in the work tonight. I'll say a bit more about it later. But I have these profiles, which are basically probability distributions, multinomial probability distributions at the 1 cent level. And so that generalizes these ideas into the timbral domain. And I think there's a number of new kinds of things that we might be able to do because of the mathematical character of these multinomials. Now, I thought what I'd do now is play a musical example that uses this technology, that uses the acquisition of the profile during the performance, that allows me to control via compression and expansion note density issues, and that allows me to control also during the performance. I can select, well, am I in the 1 second on the sort of on the back of the performer and as a kind of harmonic shadow, or am I looking at things more globally as to what we've been doing all along? So all of these are available to me here, and of course, as always, you can't use everything unless you have a lot of time. So this is a short piece of about 4 minutes in length that I was lucky enough to do with Louis Sclavis, who's a French bass clarinetist, saxophonist in Paris, or he lives actually in Lyon. And so this is a few years back in a concert there. And let me just, I've got that right up here, so it should work without a glitch. Just a brief word about this. Oliver Johnson, a great drummer who had worked with Steve Lacy for many years, was tragically, well, his life came to an end in a very tragic way, and he was murdered near the Forum des Halles, and so Louis knew him, I knew him quite well, and so we decided in the concert to make a kind of lament for him. And when we walked out on, we talked about a little bit about what we were going to do, but not very much. And I just said to Louis, well, this has really got to be a good lament. And so here it is. Okay. So now, what I want to do is say something about melody, and I had some of the ingredients for that in the piece in that particular thing there where I was controlling things. So this is something we've been using not only to analyze things in a real performance context in real time and so on, but in conjunction with some music information retrieval type projects that we're working on. So this is what I would call a sort of whatever Wessel thinks about Eugene Narmore. I had a lot of trouble understanding, getting through the two books. They're very tricky to read, but anyway, with some patience and talking to Gene, and also Carol Krumhansel had done some very nice work with Narmore's ideas. So this is a kind of a little expanded version of the idea. We have the notion of an implicative interval here, and it can be a big interval upwards. And so, for example, that might be an interval that's bigger than 6 semitones, and then we have staying the same, pitch doesn't change, small interval downward, and so on. So you could actually, by putting the appropriate probabilities into this Markov chain here, what we're going to do is move from the implicative interval to the realized interval. So we have a little 3-note sequence. We look at this interval, and then we look what happens next. So you can do this notion of post-skip reversals. You know, if you up a large leap, then you might start moving down in a stepwise manner, and so on. So you can take a lot of the ideas about that you'll see in melodic practice and put them in here without having to say what the pitch classes are. You only give the ranges of the pitch. So you might say that those are parameters. You might say that the small stepwise motion is really just under 3 semitones. And if we have these medium-sized intervals, they're between 3 and 6 semitones, and so on. So that you can capture a fair amount without saying what the pitch classes are or what the rag is. We're actually analyzing a whole collection of Carnatic rags and performances of these rags by various singers using this particular model. So what you can do with the model is build a space of melodies. In other words, you can take in this case we've got, 7 by 7, that's 49 dimensions, and we've got some, they have to add up to 1, so we've got just 40, we've got 41 dimensions, or 42 dimensions in this particular thing. So that's a pretty high dimensional structure, but you can kind of squeeze it without a lot of stress down into some 2D representations. So here I've got a space of melodies, and in this particular representation I was actually using only skips and steps, small intervals and large intervals that either went up or down or stayed the same. So it was a 5 by 5, or actually in that case a 20-dimensional structure if you realize there are only 20 degrees of freedom there. Now, so over here in this region of the space you've got melodies that are like jagged, disjunct, and over here you've got this sort of spaghetti type thing, small intervals, and then in between, it's kind of like a football in a way, you've got other parameter settings, and they kind of fit nicely into this structure. So if we in an a priori manner fix that structure, and say, well, that's a pretty reasonable way to think about melodies. And you could drive around. We built an exposition for the exploratorium in which we had it on a joystick. So way over there was spaghetti, way over there was disjunct, and then in between it was kind of mixtures, reasonable mixtures of skips and steps and things that would occur like post-skip reversal and things like that. So we've got this layout. Now what happens if we listen to something and we want to say, well, where in the layout is it? Like I might want to be listening along and then just do what's going on. And right there, if it's spaghetti, I'm going to want to move in the spaghetti way. Or I might want to do something disjunctor. In other words, I'd like to be informed about what's going on in my world with respect to what I can control. it's kind of like this listening assistant ideas. I sure like to have knowledge about what's happening when I'm performing, and sometimes my own ears, I just don't feel as up to it as they should be. So this is definitely in the area of what might call musical prosthetics. But so what we did, we with Peter Kosaki and a graduate student in computer science there, we would take melodies and we'd be able to shove them into this space and put them into this space using convex optimization. And it was a very nice technique because it got rid of the problems of local minima with this kind of a structure. You can see that in this particular space there's a big hole over here, but we got the melody that we shoved in here right in a reasonable position. It made sense with respect to the space. So that's kind of an idea we have about this uniform idea of thinking about things in terms of spaces. There's a lot of new ways to reason about things. I saw the most wonderful new version of Kohonen's self-organizing maps applied to exploration of timbre, where you have literally thousands, large databases of sound, and this is called the timbral searchlight. And I'll be happy to talk about it over the wine as well, but it was a remarkable, again, application of this spatial layout business to understanding in a more intuitive way what's going on musically. Now, the loudspeaker issue. Well, with Adrian and with also the goodwill, I'm going to have to be winding up here, the goodwill of Meyer Sound, we've been lucky enough to pursue some rather extraordinarily fanciful ideas. And well, while I was at IRCAM, before I moved to Berkeley, I'm sorry that I'm not looking out. I'm looking at my own slides, so I apologize for that. But I guess it's working. It's too late now. Here we started out with a cube, and at IRCAM they have what's called the Time, which is these cubes. You can get a reasonable amount of control, but not very much, maybe just a dipole at best. And then here we've got a 12-sided object with separate drivers. These are all acoustically isolated. They're in separate cavities, about 1 liter in size, and they're 4-inch drivers. And it turns out to be you can actually get a fair number of things. And then we did some analysis and asked ourselves, well, how many, let's say that we really want to get fine-grained radiation patterns, like we do see and we're able to measure from instruments or other kinds of sound sources. How many drivers, how finely do we have to sample this sphere? Wow, turned out to be a big number. And so here's 120 tweeters in I'm putting a flashlight on an array this is an icosahedron, triangular facets, and 6 drivers as if they were located in a sort of queue from a pool table, you know. And they're all independent of each other. And the digital data is sent from the computer to this device. It's converted to sound via digital amplifiers inside. And so this has proven to give us some very fine, we can get 5 spherical harmonics of degree 5 of this kind of a speaker. Right now we're in the process, we just got some new hardware here of putting this on top of that, and then this goes on top of a sub. So we should have a full-blown system. It's still going to be awkward to move it around to concerts. I mean, more than one musician is required to just get it out on stage and so on. But this is, I think, an interesting research tool to ask these questions. What do we really need to have if we want to have dynamic radiation patterns? We want to engage the room in interesting ways, and we want to be able to control it easily and simply in musically interesting ways. I don't want to go into the other applications, but room acousticians are interested in these things, and there's a lot of other things you can do with this because we can form very tight beams. We can actually explore the acoustics of a room, find hot spots or bad locations that are giving us flutter echo and so on. And so, but the real impetus for doing this originally, be it at IRCAM before or when we got to started up at CIRMMT, was to really have something that we called a source model loudspeaker that would bring the electronic performing musician into the same acoustical space as a acoustic musician. Now, I mentioned that we're using Ethernet here on this thing, and that work was begun in the mid-90s in conjunction with trying to build a digital guitar, or we did it successively. Actually, it was Gibson was funding that particular work. They didn't pay attention to our insistence on keeping it an open standard and wanted to go off and build their own proprietary version of it. And I think they failed at that. But here's something I think that's exciting, and I want you to be aware of it if you don't know about it, because I think it's going to make a difference. We hope that it gets adopted and that it gets into the kind of devices that we would have access to, like laptops and so on. There's a lot of interest in it from the people like Meyer Sound have pretty much adopted it, and Harman, Broadcom's making chipsets now that use it. But it's basically an Ethernet standard that allows you to reserve bandwidth. It timestamps all the data. Looks like we can get OSC support into it from the application layer level, and so on. And so it looks like an exciting development, and well, we'll see how it works out. There's a new line of Wayfield-like arrays that Meyer would build called the CAL arrays, which have 72 tweeters in them and 24 4-inch drivers, and it's all run from this AVB, Ethernet AVB standard. So if you're not aware of it, take a look at it, and I know at a place like McGill you'll be able to pick it up and start using it. Now, since I started talking about the future, I'd like to continue for a while and say something about this client cloud sensor. Well, you know, if you look at the App Store, you'll find out there are lots and lots of musical applications, some of which actually use the cloud in interesting ways. Like I'm particularly struck by the ocarina, which may seem like a musical toy in some sense, but the way it talks to the cloud and allows you to interrogate what other people are doing, or even perform in some sense with them, I think brings something quite new to the situation. There's a similar arrangement which is Magic Fiddle does, and the St. Lawrence String Quartet he has a YouTube video of them playing a string quartet with this instrument, and it seems like they've addressed the control of dynamics in a clever way, even though these don't provide pressure. The iBone handles dynamics by setting the tilt. So it's a 2D, again, the trombone is a 2D instrument in some sense, slide position against harmonic number. So the layout that the iBone uses is a 2D pitch space layout and drive around in it. And of course there's Touch OSC, which is we're very happy to see. And I think that's been one of the influences that's gotten the OSC standard out more into the world. Can control now digital performer, Logic, et cetera with it. But this idea that in the cloud you have massive amounts of computation available, massive amounts of data. If you haven't tried SoundHound, I'm amazed. I put in some Boulez and some different pianists playing. I wanted to see if they could find performers, and it can actually nail performers like different pianists playing the Beethoven piano sounds from very small snippets. So they're doing something right. And one thing that I'm happy to see is that it is available not only in the iPhone but on the Android as well. So this idea that we just cannot get stuck in an Apple world. They're doing a great job, but God, we can't let them control our bodies. That's something that Adrian said the other day that I just love, because God, when they start talking about pinching being patented, well, anyway, interesting things going on here. We have to pay attention as much as we might think of it, of the toy-like character that they have. I think there's a lot to be said for taking a look at that. So one of the things that, just to harp on for a moment, and I'm going to shut down here fairly quickly, the idea that somehow we can get out to lots of different kind of rendering engines. You know, the Kindle, I know I don't know how well it's taking off in Canada, but now the Kindle, you can get your book, but you can read it on your iPhone, on your iPad, on your Android, on your PC, on your Mac. They all work the same, and you can have your book everywhere you want. So it talks to all these different appliances or clients on the outside, and that's something I think we need to do, but we've had it for a while in music. Look at all these different user interfaces. Gosh, plucking and bowing and putting strings down, and here keys. God, and there's not even one bassoon. Fingering, you know, very diverse. Here's the accordion with a cantina or a bandoneon-like thing. They all have different layouts, different ways of controlling them. But yet, whether we play by ear or we read music and so on, or what we should be doing is, you know, if we're going to read music, we ought to keep the ears involved as well, obviously. And we use our, you know, this sensory motor homunculus. This is one of the best ones I've found. You know, look at those hands; they're big, and big ears too, and that mouth and tongue. And so somehow the surface of the skull to attach electrodes at the moment doesn't seem to me a good candidate for a musical interface. But so notice these instruments really play with that as the touch part. The touch part's all there. Now we need to have a lot of skill to play them, but isn't it interesting that somehow that with all this diversity in UI, we yet have musical information and so on that can be performed or rendered by these instruments with a human performer in between, obviously. Well, what might the future look like? So we've got the cloud up there with massive amounts of sounds, songs. I've finally gone over to using the word song. All my students don't say piece or work anymore. They just say, oh, that song was nice, that Beethoven sonata. And data and massive amounts of computation on demand. That's how that SoundHound can work. It really uses the cloud in an interesting way. So we've got a diversity of devices here. We've even got a Buchla 100 here, which can easily talk to a Mac. There's a controller. This is the Eigen harp from keyboards, of course, iPads and iPhones, and a plethora of other things that are going to come along. How do we keep that world up here and this world working together? Well, I think we need some enabling technologies, and I think we've got one that we might be able to well, it's being widely used in CIRMMT and in IRCAM, and we've built a number of Max objects. If you look at our website, we've got a lot of things that Adrian and Michael Pazinski have put together in our depot that make use of this. So this is an idea of what SDIF is. You know how back in the Mac Paint days, you had just, these pixels, and if you wanted to enlarge this letter, you just couldn't do it? Well, you'd get pixelations all over the place. Well, that's kind of where we are, I think, with audio waveforms. If we work with just raw samples, we can crossfade them. And we can operate on them with some crude measures. But why don't we go ahead and try to do what has long been a very useful thing in the graphic domain, in the sound world, have an abstract. This happens to be an editor here, and I will talk about the abstract. Have abstract representations of the material. And then we can, scale them, transform them. We can obtain graceful degradation. These are mutable. We can mess with them. And we can perform with them. So they can become not just part of an on-off world, but a part of a world that allows us to reshape the sounds. And, you know, I don't know what Girl Talk would do with this, but I would hope that she'd move, I mean, Gillis would move into the whole area of shaping things rather than just splicing things. So what do we mean by a sound description? Well, it's a parametric representation. It should be mutable. Nice to have it be concise so we can get a grip on it. But it shouldn't be just for encoding purposes. It should be our compression. It should be for transformation and more performative activities. And so here are some that are in existence and are being used in the group at IRCAM. I think maybe here too, some activity with it. So we have, you know, we can deal with the time domain samples, but I think these sinusoidal tracks are very, very useful. The program Spear actually outputs this, and so does Loris and other things. The IRCAM tools and so on also do a pretty good job of generating S-stiff things. And then we'll think of the rendering engines that we're going to somehow talk to the cloud with as using this standard, and we can hopefully get by and have not just a world of apples, but a world of oranges and pears and other kinds of interfaces. And here's just an example of an editor that Amar Shahadri built some time back. It's actually, given that we've abandoned our SGI platform, it's no longer operational, but this uses the general framework for sound description interchange format to provide an editing thing with an editing environment that operates on different kinds of representations. Fundamental frequency up here, resonance models and so on, time varying spectra and so on. So that, this kind of thing needs to be looked at again and revitalized. And given that we're in this era of having these resources that are available to us. And I think the other point maybe that I'll close with is that don't be fooled by always being connected. It turns out I'm not connected in this room, and I can't be, I was told. No internet, well, maybe there is somewhere, but at least there wasn't a wireless one. And I think you're going to find that to be the case all over. There are going to be the hotspots, and there'll be the places where the phone kind of works, and there'll be notions about caching data on your, look, we're going to have a terabyte of flash. So let your imagination in our mobile devices. So being the connectivity issues, and let's make sure that we've got enough computational horsepower in the clients. There are some people who say, well, the client doesn't have to do much. It's the cloud that does it all. Well, no. We know from the musical work that we need to do and the instruments that we want to have as clients that we want crunch, computational horsepower in our mobile device when it's unconnected. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you.